Welcome to join the Finance Mandarin live events. Today's event's topic is a China political landscape, China's 14th five-year plan insights. We're so happy to have another excellent organizer, Week in China, join hands together to co-organize for this live event. We have Week in China. We'll welcome Steve and May today to join with us. So today we are going to look at the what and how and why of the China political landscape, the 14th five-year plan. So before we go ahead, I would like to introduce our friends and Week in China. So Steve, we'd like to introduce a little bit about Week in China.
Yeah, thanks, Vienne. So I set up Week in China back in 2009. It's a weekly digital magazine designed for decision makers around the world who want to understand China better. The main focus is business. We cover about 20 industries. Nowadays, a big focus is the internet and technology sector. Typically in any given weekly magazine, that will be sometimes as much as a third to a half of the content. But back in the beginning, when we first started, we covered more stories on things like the steel industry and heavy industry. So what you can kind of see with us is that over the years, our coverage of China or the economy of China has really evolved as China's moved up the value chain and become more of a tech power. We publish about 20 pages a week, and we kind of curate the key news coming out of China, making it readable, but also delivering it in an analytical style that helps people understand better. This June, we did our 500th issue. And we also produce, aside from the weekly product, we do books as well, like, for example, this book, Instead of Chinese History, and also special focus publications on big themes, for example, like Belt and Road Initiative. We have a website archive of close to 7,500 articles on pretty much all the key news that's come out of China over the last 12 years or so. We also have apps for iPhone, iPad, and Android. And basically, we have been sponsored by HSBC since the outset. But if people who are watching this webinar would like to get a complimentary subscription, they can use that URL at the bottom of the screen, weekinchina.com/Finance Mandarin. It'd be a good time to do it because we're going to move to a paid subscription model next year. So if you use that Finance Mandarin URL, you can get Week in China still for free.
Excellent, Steve. Yes, I want to compliment with your story. The time I know Week in China is actually 10 years ago when I was coaching an investor from JP Morgan. And he told me his broker from HSBC sent him this wonderful Week in China. There's so many stories every week. So he shared that with me. So 10 years ago, I already know Week in China. But we're also coaching the bankers and investors in the capital market. So that's definitely excellent content. So we already introduced this magazine to a lot of our existing students and alumni as well. Yes, excellent. Thank you for the introduction. So now perhaps you would like to introduce yourself a little bit, and then our China expert, May, as well.
So I'm the editor of the publication. I've basically been in Hong Kong since 1997, prior to the handover. And I was previously the Asia editor of Euromoney magazine, and also the editor of Finance Asia for about 8 years as well. So, you know, I've traveled around the region a lot. I've seen quite a bit of China as well in my time. And so I think, you know, my story is one of being basically a business journalist since the start of my career, and pretty much all of it being in Asia and focusing on China primarily for the last 12 years.
Right.
Maybe say a bit about that.
Yes, so now we're going to introduce May. But before we go, next time we need to interview you about your story, your interview with Wang Qishan, the China vice president nowadays, and then your high profile story with other senior executives, because you understand their mindset, and you talk to them for their level. So definitely you could tell us a lot of intelligence and insight from the senior executives. So May, that's your turn. Could you please introduce you a little bit? I know you well from Goldman
Yes.
and from CNN, but you need to tell to our connection more about yourself.
Okay, my pleasure. My name is Zhang. I grew up in Northeast China, the Rust Belt of China, but went to university in Beijing. After that, I went to the US for graduate school. Always studied journalism or mass communications. My first real job was with CNN in its headquarters in Atlanta. And then in 1999, CNN transferred me from Atlanta to Hong Kong, from international news to financial news. And then shortly after that, I jumped over to work at the investment banks, first Solomon Smith Barney and then Goldman Sachs for 11 years. And I became a columnist at Week in China 5-6 years ago, and with a focus on cultural and social issues, because my mission as a bicultural and a bilingual person who has always embraced globalization, my mission is really to try to be a bridge between China and the Western world. And I hope our magazine has done a pretty good job in this area as well.
Yeah, indeed. You also thank you for May and joining with us as like a VIP speaker for our different cultural and political live events, whether it's lunch and learn section or one-to-one with our senior decision makers in the banking finance sectors. After the training, they all say, I want to book May for the next section. Yeah, so this is, if you like to get more insight and listen to the insider who know the banking, finance, and understand the China culture, the real China, the insight, join with our event. And today is the first one to start with. So good to understand our speakers. So later on, if you have any questions related to the China political landscape, it's time to write us any question. And within the time today, we'll try to answer you, or later on, we catch up with more events soon. So today is a live event. Now it's live streaming, broadcasting to LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and the other 33 social media. If you missed for today's live event, you can still book the digital content on demand, or also welcome to subscribe for Week in China to further understand China more and to learn more about the inside story. Excellent. So this is the Week in China. This you can download from iPad and your iPhone, and also by email. You send it to you on Friday. Every Friday, 3 p.m. We're looking forward for this wonderful magazine. A lot of our students nowadays would say that they would learn a lot of story from this English version and combined with Finance Mandarin first-hand information learning the platform, they get a much more clear landscape and idea about what's the real China. Like the latest version about Joe Biden, that's 2 weeks ago, and Give Me Five is a 5-year plan. So today we're going to go in depth to look at this topic, because this is still new. A lot of policies actually are coming out soon. So we are going to get much more insight about the history, about the formation procedures, and how does it affect you different sectors. If you are in private equity, hedge fund, private bank, and pension fund, insurance, and all the other industry, if you have portfolio in China, this workshop definitely is important and practical for you. Stay tuned, and we're going to have much more information soon. So now we're going to start with the 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan. So here I hand over to you, May.
Okay. Let's start with a little bit of a historical background. I'm not sure if you have attended our previous sessions on China's political landscape, but we can have a very quick review of the following very basic facts. Firstly, the People's Republic of China was founded in 1949, and it was led by the Communist Party of China. And then the communists were led by Mao Zedong, or Chairman Mao, who ruled China with an iron hand until his death in 1976. 2 years after Mao died, Deng Xiaoping changed China's development path by launching economic reforms and also open up policies. And since then, as you all know, or we all know, China has experienced unprecedented economic boom and is now the largest or second largest world economy, depends on whether you want to use the absolute GDP number or the PPP number. But now Steve will talk about the historical background and also the earliest 5-year plans in China.
Thanks, May. So the original 5-year plan was born in the former Soviet Union. And the first 5-year plan was actually created by Stalin's Russia, by Stalin, and it came out in 1928. And then after the Civil War in China, when the Chinese communists beat the KMT, China had a relationship with Stalin's Soviet Union of almost like the little brother, big brother, with the looking to the Soviet Union for ideas. And Mao saw how the 5-year planning process that Stalin was using had helped to very quickly and effectively rebuild the Soviet economy after the ravages of World War II. So he asked Stalin for help doing this 5-year plan for China. And so the first 5-year plan for China was then started to be planned in 1949, basically. And really and truly, it was designed to bring in capital from the Soviet Union to a China that was also devastated by not only the Second World War, but also by the Chinese Civil War. So the Soviets brought in technology. They helped to build China's first car factory. They brought in 180 so engineers, gave loans, and basically that 5-year plan ran from roughly 1953 to 1957. And it saw China's steel production basically reach 16.56 million tons, which was twice the aggregate amount that was made in China between 1900 and 1949. So it was a pretty ambitious plan that was basically executed very quickly with a lot of help from the Soviet Union, which was then China's main ally. Basically, though, during that whole process, Zhou Enlai, who was Mao's number 2, went to see Stalin in 1952, and he basically spoke to Stalin about what we want to do with the 5-year plan. And one of the things that Stalin said was, try not to be too ambitious. He wanted to temper some of the ambitions of these new leaders in China like Mao. Unfortunately, what happened was that Mao didn't really listen to this advice from Stalin. And in fact, when the second 5-year plan was created, it really became quite an infamous 5-year plan, because this was the 5-year plan that's associated with the so-called Great Leap Forward, when Mao really had massive ambitions to basically increase steel output in China so that China would overtake Britain in 15 years and catch up with America quite soon afterwards. Obviously, the Great Leap Forward was something that was of human tragedy, with about 30 million people estimated to have died of famine. The reason being that so much of the resources and so much of the targets were unrealistic in order to try and reach these targets for steel. So a lot of pots and pans and various things were melted down, farmyard tools, just so that basically these backyard furnaces that were built to meet these local government officials' targets could happen. But unfortunately, most of the steel that was produced in that way was actually useless. So not only did it sort of cause a setback in terms of the steel production, but it was also obviously led to many deaths. It's actually estimated that as much as 40% of China's housing was destroyed during that period, because of all the bricks being reallocated to other industrial purposes. So basically, the Great Leap Forward was basically a bit of a disaster economically speaking, and showed that actually 5-year plans could backfire if they were too ambitious and misdirected. And what then happened was there was a hiatus before the next 5-year plan was ushered in between 1958 and 1962. And that was designed to put the Chinese economy back on a more even keel, with a more normalized plan. So we're probably going to the next slide now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, so the next slide is about how 5-year plans are formulated and which government organs are involved. Steve, why don't you start?
So going back to what I was just saying a bit earlier, the 5-year plans in the early days had a strong input from Chairman Mao. So a strong leader who gave very strong direction as to what the plan should really emphasize and focus on. Later on, when Deng Xiaoping became the paramount leader of China in the late 70s, his approach to the 5-year plan changed quite dramatically. His idea was to have more consultation, bring in more experts, and make it more of a proper economic planning process that was based more around practicality and what the country needed to basically build for the long term, and not try to do things sort of in sprints, but to basically run a much longer marathon, taking more of a 30-year view. So what we have today really with the 5-year plans is more a legacy of Deng Xiaoping's planning process and less of the original 5-year plans from the 50s.
So the NDRC, in the initial stage of the formulating process, NDRC plays the leading role. I assume everyone knows what NDRC is, a 发改委. It means it's the National Development and Reform Commission, and it's a macroeconomic agency under the State Council. So NDRC initiate the planning typically years before the due date or release date of the plan. They first send out the consultation papers to experts and scholars and think tanks, and then they will consolidate all the feedbacks and compile a report to send it to the CPC, which is Communist Party Central Committee, for review. And it will go through back and forth, actually rounds and rounds, or even hundreds of rounds of back and forth consultation, review, revision. And the Central Committee, again, if you have joined our previous seminars, you probably will remember when we talk about the Communist Party, the structure is like a pyramid. At the bottom is the 91 plus million Communist Party members across the nation. And then above that is the Central Committee that has over 300 members. Then above that is the Politburo, 25 members. And then above that is the most powerful political body. We call it the Politburo Standing Committee. But then at the very top sits the General Secretary, which is Xi Jinping today. So the Central Committee, typically they designate the Central Policy Research Office, which is probably the most important think tank within China, to review the 发改委's report and then add the political priorities or concerns into this largely political report of recommendations. And then the Central Committee will discuss and approve this 5-year plan report during the 5th of Platinum, because actually the Central Committee meets at least once a year at a plenary session, and we call that the Plenum. And the 5-year plan tend to be approved by the committee during the 5th Plenum, which just took place actually last month. And after that, of course, they announced the 14th 5-year plan. So after they approve that, they will send it back to NDRC for finalization or finalizing all the details. Usually holds the annual event in springtime, usually it's March. And after that, only after that, it becomes official.
Right.
Yeah. I know.
Okay, Steve, by then I just add a little bit here. So, sorry, Steve, if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the last 5-year plan, the 13th 5-year plan, it took 3 years to formulate. So that gives you an idea of a sort of time frame of planning that goes into this and the so-called back and forths that May was describing. The one slight difference this time round with previous 5-year plans is, as everyone probably realizes, Xi Jinping is an incredibly powerful leader. So he's had a very big input into the direction of the 5-year plan. I mean, he did a whole bunch of meetings and consultations with academics, think tanks, 7 consultation sessions around the country with different local governments and different sort of industry heads. And also, what's also interesting about this 5-year plan, which is a little bit different, is again with the move in China towards more of a sort of internet-based approach, digital approach to things. They actually set up a so-called advice-seeking office online, where individuals could actually send in their suggestions for what they think the 5-year plan should be emphasizing. So a bit more, communication, therefore, with the broader general public and not just the sort of the think tank elite. So that's a bit of a change.
Can I also add one interesting point is because NDRC is the macroeconomic management agency, so their report tend to focus on the economic side, but the party, the central committee, they tend to see things more holistically and long term. For example, NDRC may, for the benefit of the GDP growth, they may feel reluctant to advocate for a quick transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy. But the party thinks for the benefit of the environment, the healthcare system, and also the energy independence, they may want to speed up the transition. So that's why we said that there's check and balance and trade-offs. But ultimately, as we always said in our previous sessions, the party calls the shot.
Indeed, yeah. Thank you, May and Steve. You've been just like introduce us, make us understand more about when and why China has a 5-year plan for the development of the whole countries. And also you show us like 5-year plan that how is it formed and its scope and the domain. And it's very, very helpful. So in the next one, we're going to share to our audience here. That's what May and Steve talking about, like the CPP and the NDRC and the State Council, and then the different major finance regulators like CSRC and CBIRC, SAFE and PBOC. Those are all the finance regulators our current students, especially decision makers, have paid attention to, and they have the delegation to visit in Beijing or Shanghai because they try to understand what are the latest policy under the 5-year plans, like what are the capital market opening, the licensing for asset management, for pension fund, or for a different kind of new products. So this is part, if you would like to know more, in the digital Finance Mandarin platform here, we have all this kind of story with case studies, like just like the Ant Group, the IPO was suspended, and that is called off by CSRC and CBRC and PBOC and SAFE, these 4 major departments. So if you want to know more about detail, keep tuned, and then we keep going for the next part here, the mechanisms. Go back to you, May.
Okay, so when do 5-year plans get announced? A typical 5-year plan document these days, it's about 100 pages. And 100,000 plus characters. I'm not sure how many characters our Finance Mandarin's students can master, but I hope if you continue with the Finance Mandarin down the road, you may be able to read the 5-year plan booklet.
Definitely. We do have students can read it with the help of the platform. Yes.
Yeah. But before, actually, especially during Mao time, the 5-year plans were never made public. It was treated as almost like a state secret. It's actually only 10 years ago, during the release of the 12th 5-year plan, the government felt proud and also confident with the economic accomplishments. They authorized the official media outlets to publish the full 5-year plans as soon as it was ratified. And Steve.
Okay, yeah, so the current 5-year plan, basically where we stand now is that after the plenum, there is a 5-year plan. A press conference was held after the plenum in which some of the broad brush initiatives for the 5-year plan came out, but the actual finished document will not be public until it is ratified by the NPC. So we'll have to wait until March, probably March next year, to see the final document and with its 100,000 characters, as May described it. But the fact that they had the press conference was kind of interesting, because that obviously, basically it shows that there's now an attempt to be more transparent about the 5-year plan and really convey what its general thrust is, as opposed to the state secret type mentality of the 1950s and 60s. And also, who was at the press conference was kind of interesting. That the Minister of Science and Technology was there speaking at the press conference, which sent a very powerful signal that at the core of this 5-year plan will be the tech sector, probably. Yeah, and he actually said at the press conference, technology self-sufficiency is a strategic pillar of the nation's development, which kind of speaks for itself, really. And also, there's been an attempt with the last 5-year plan to really make it more accessible to foreigners. And so one of the things that they did, Xinhua, the official state news agency, put together a sort of infomercial cartoon of a sort of theme song. Maybe May, you could maybe talk about it.
Actually, you can find it on YouTube if you type in a song about China's 13th 5-year plan. It's really catchy. It's in English, and the singers, they're male and female singers. They tend to they speak with the American accent, and it really is a good summary of the whole formulation process. Plus, you also get to learn 13舞 because the song keeps singing 13舞, 13舞.
That's true. Let me tell you the story. It's actually because we mentioned about this during our discussions, and then I actually introduced this song to one of the president, and who is in charge for their digital platform, the digital information, and he found it very interesting because number one is a very visual and vivid concept. And 13舞 learning immediately for even level 1 student, and only starting for 150 Chinese character can understand 13舞. But then the major part we're talking about 14舞. That's what we talk today, 14 5-year plan. So by doing that, that means the Chinese government try to be more open, more transparent, and then try to get the message across, so let more like non-Chinese speaker could also understand the China policy initiatives. So definitely this is a good sign. So if you're interested, of course, you check it out. And also in our lesson here, we have this kind of like songs about the 5-year plan and for level 1 students. So don't say that your Chinese is not good enough, you're not going to learn the China political landscape. This is essential. This is a practical. If you want to know China, learning the language and plus the China market intelligence, so make you a better decision maker. That's very good, May, you mentioned about this song. So this is also the 14舞. Yes, okay. So talking about impact then.
The previous slide. Yeah, Steve, go ahead.
So the key feature of most of the 5-year plans is some longer term national policy initiative. Sometimes very major pieces of infrastructure, which may be money-losing propositions in the short term, involving large amounts of upfront investment, but they can be very transformational for the broader economy and have great effects. So one example of that would be back in 2004, the government decided it wanted to focus on the railway sector, having in the previous decade and a half focused mostly on building highway system, a bit like the interstates in the US. But they realized that they wanted to have a more efficient railway system. At that time, there was only 36,000 kilometers of rail in China. So there was a goal that by 2020, there should be at least 100,000 kilometers of rail. So that's what happened. And also, part and parcel of that was the big initiative to build a big high-speed rail network of bullet trains, which would be fairly transformational for the country. And through the 5-year planning process, that initiative was able to be achieved because it was done on a very long-term, well-planned basis. It wasn't dependent on election cycles or anything like that. The 5-year planning process does enable China to take a very long view, which is one of the country's advantages, frankly, when it comes to doing big infrastructure projects. So by 2020, by this year, China had actually exceeded its target. It had 140,000 kilometers of rail line. And also of that, 36,000 kilometers of it was high-speed rail, which is easily the biggest in the world, and actually has been totally, for anyone who's been in China and traveled on the high-speed trains, it is totally transformational in the way in which it's completely altered the economy and created this new cluster effect where big cities are now connected with the hinterland in a greater way, so that smaller cities actually become almost like commuter cities for the big cities. And this has a big cluster effect in terms of industry, supply chain, tourism, you name it. Various things have been very positive because of the high-speed trains. It's probably been one of the smartest things China has done in the last sort of 16, well, the actual first line really only opened in 2008 from Beijing to Tianjin, which is a fairly short line. But over the last 12 years, it's been one of the smartest investments China's made because it has had massive effects on the broader economy, making the economy more efficient. And that brings me to a second example, which is obviously something which gets into the news a lot nowadays, which is 5G telecommunications. And China took a very strong view after 3G that it didn't want to be a follower in terms of telecom standards and technologies, and decided very early on that it wanted to be a leader when it came to 5G. Now, obviously that was something that got built into the 5-year plans pretty early on. I mean, as early as 2004, there was a plan in the 5-year plan to basically try and get, nationwide internet coverage, which was basically a precursor to their thinking on 5G. And in the 2010 5-year plan, the 12th one, they explicitly mentioned the Internet of Things. And obviously the Internet of Things is really, by extension, 5G. It's what 5G really is. So it's the main benefit that 5G is going to bring us in terms of all these connected devices, autonomous driving, etc. And so what you've seen here was really that when it came to this planning process, companies like Huawei had a very strong long-term sort of sight of where the government wanted to go and where the government would be supported. So that's one of the reasons why Huawei went all in terms of its massive investments in 5G and becoming a leading player in 5G infrastructure. So you could say that, there's been this big spat with the US in terms of, trying to hobble Huawei because it's too powerful and it's going to be installing its networks in too many countries, and that worries the US on national security concerns. But what you have to say about the 5-year planning process with big sort of things like these big transformational industries like this is that it does give China a certain advantage that they can sit down and say, where do we want to be in 15 years through 3 5-year plans? And they can achieve that. Whereas you've got to say that if you look at sort of the Western world, it's a different sort of way of governing, and Western world doesn't have 5-year plans. There are no plans that go beyond an election cycle. And that probably explains why, although the US regrets it now, the US wasn't thinking 10, 15 years ago about how do we make one of our companies like Cisco into competitor to Huawei and become a leading player in 5G, because there was no long-term vision, no long-term plan. So the 5-year plan is definitely one of the things that can give China a big edge in areas like this. So that's where it does have massive advantages. And obviously, the other thing that was in the last 5-year plan was the Made in China 2025 vision, which again is all about moving China up the value chain in terms of smart manufacturing, bioscience, and all these areas where China has a vision to be a leader. May?
Yeah, actually, I would just, considering the time is short, I'm just going to mention briefly about the reoccurring theme in recent years associated with the 5-year plans. There are two, we call it the 2 centenaries. One is to build a 全面小康社会. It means building a comprehensively and moderately well-off society by 2021, which means by end of this year. And the 2021 is the centenary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. The second centenary is 2049, which is the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. So the first one, in terms of 小康社会, actually, if it's just purely from GDP perspective, China has already reached that, or reached the goal, or accomplished that mission by 2000, because the threshold in terms of US dollar per capita GDP threshold for the 小康社会 was $800 US, and China met that threshold in 2000. Since then, actually, the Chinese economy has booming even more dramatically or more rapidly, especially following the WTO entry. So now China's per capita GDP, at least last year, was over $10,000 US. And the starting point when Deng Xiaoping started this 小康社会, set that goal, that was 1980. And that's when China's per capita GDP was only $250 US. So in other words, it means in 40 years, the per capita GDP of China has grown or risen by 40 times. And then the second, the strong and modern socialist country, actually there are other adjective words as well, including democratic and harmonious, these words. This one is actually first put out by Xi Jinping as part of his Chinese dream concept. In essence, it basically is about China's prosperity, collective effort, socialism, and also rejuvenation of the national glory. The Chinese government, as you may know, is very good at coming up with simple and catchy slogans. If we have time in the future, maybe we can look at some of the interesting slogans and then do a deep dive to talk about the background and why and how and what kind of impact it has brought to China. Okay, now let's move on.
Yeah, definitely. So we will have this kind of learning the slogan, and by learning this, we understand more stories and learning by case. Okay, the next one, talking about impact.
Yes, yeah. In terms of whether the goals have been met, actually, the Soviets, when they set up the 5-year plans, they tend to be too ambitious with the goal, but then under-deliver. China is the opposite, except for the great leap forward that Steve talked about. Actually, since 1986, which is the 7th 5-year plan, the Chinese government has always set single-digit GDP growth target, but the country has in reality, the economy has grown more than 10%. This year, however, is interesting because of the Trump's trade war and also the pandemic, COVID pandemic. This year, even though the government set the goal of 6.5% growth for GDP, but is most likely it will miss the target. But I don't think the government will be too worried about it. And Steve will explain why.
Yeah, it's interesting that in the 12th 5-year plan, there was a target of basically China having a GDP of 100 trillion RMB by the end of 2020. And that looks likely to be met. So that target has been reached. But the other thing that's going to probably come out of this 5-year plan that's been heavily hinted is that for the first time, there may be no GDP target for this next 5-year plan. So rather than sort of saying we want a minimum of 5% growth per year, they may just leave that number out of the 5-year plan and emphasize instead what they're talking about as quality growth, which is really trying to emphasize other social factors such as the environment, social stability, other sort of more qualitative things that local government officials should focus more of their energies on. And the other thing that's probably going to be in there are sort of, there will still be some compulsory objectives in there as well. For example, normally most of the 5-year plans are always mentioned of what's known as the government's red line on the amount of land that must be kept aside for arable use for farming, as opposed to being redeveloped by real estate developers. And that number is 186 mu. So that number is viewed as sort of semi-sacred and normally goes into all the 5-year plans. And also there's normally something in there about lifting a certain number of million people out of poverty every year as well. So you can expect those types of things to be in the plan as well. Should we move on to the next slide?
Yep.
Yep. Steve, why don't you go over this slide?
Yeah. So though there's going to be probably no mention of a GDP growth target, there has been some sort of hints anyway that, you know, Xi Jinping is quite keen on the economy doubling in size again by 2035. So you can infer from that that would require something like an annual GDP growth rate of about 4.3%. So although it probably won't be a number in the 5-year plan, it's the number you should probably have at the back of your mind. The other thing that's probably going to be in there is the so-called, this new buzz term that's being used, the dual circulation model of economic growth. And what this dual circulation really boils down to is, well, it's dual, it's two things. On the one hand, it basically is recognized that with the trade war and the tech war with the US, China needs to have greater self-sufficiency, particularly in areas like technology. So dual circulation will be one, trying to basically promote more autarky, as it were, in the tech sector and less dependence on countries like the US, and also to also protect the Chinese economy from being so overly dependent on the outside world, but boosting of domestic consumption, so the China market becomes bigger and more self-reliant. But the reason why it's called the dual circulation is that Xi Jinping has committed himself at all various international bodies and events as being a globalist. Unlike the America First policies of Donald Trump, he wants to always project himself as being a globalist. So on the flip side of this, self-sufficiency, he also wants to make sure that China's market is open for foreign firms to do business, and China's, still taking a global citizen approach to the world economy and trying to help other countries in their economies by selling things to China. So that dual circulation economic model, will probably be front and center in the 14th 5-year plan. There's also likely to be, for the first time, we've been told there's going to be an entirely separate chapter just about technology, which again goes back to what we're discussing about the issues of self-sufficiency in the tech war. But it's also a reason in there as well, because there's various areas where China wants to take the lead in new areas of the tech industry. So, for example, there was a very heavy, before the plenum, there's usually this thing called a party study session. And this is where the most senior members of the Politburo are invited to a conference where a speaker will give chapter and verse on a particular subject. And when people hear about this in the stock market, they always get very excited and start driving up the stocks of any company that's related to that particular sector. So for example, this year, the study session was on quantum technology. So in this area, China has actually done pretty well. In terms of quantum communications, China is actually in a fairly leading position. And quantum communications is, if you think about it, what it really boils down to is making networks unhackable. So for example, if between the government and the military, but those communications can't be hacked. They're impossible to hack. So it's very much a sort of national security type approach. But the other area that China's trying to catch up in is quantum computing, where it would probably be behind the US by a little bit. And obviously quantum computing has lots of applications too. And in previous years, the study sessions have basically focused on areas like AI, big data, and blockchain over the previous 3 years. So it kind of signals the sort of areas where China wants to go in terms of the sort of tech investments. And what this does is it gives other sort of players an idea of where the government's priorities are. So it tends to start to allocate capital into those areas. A good example of that as well was in earlier 5-year plans, there was a big emphasis on electric vehicles, and China's shifting over from using conventional cars and trucks to electric vehicles. And that created, obviously a huge shift in resources and the creation of a whole bunch of, new domestic champions, like companies like Xpeng, for example, and BYD, who are now getting great sort of investor interest. I mean, Xpeng listed its stock this year and it's up 4 times in the space of just a few months. So what investors can actually infer from 5-year planning language is where the next hot sector is going to be for long-term investment. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to look to the 5-year plans. And this 5-year plan is also likely to sync with this recent sort of target the government had of going carbon neutral by 2060. So there should be a lot of elements about how that's going to happen in terms of environmental investments. And again, one of the things you can probably expect is, more of an emphasis again on electric vehicles, and that will probably suggest to me that something that might come out of this next 5-year plan will be a commitment by a very powerful state grid electric network to have nationwide coverage with charging stations by a certain date, maybe the end of this 5-year plan or maybe the end of the next 5-year plan. But that will be, again, a bit like what I said earlier about the high-speed trains, a very long-term infrastructure commitment to really cover the whole of China so that electric cars become pretty much ubiquitous and easy to charge wherever you are in the country, even in the countryside. May, do you want to talk about the last item?
Actually, before I address the family plan policy, can we go back to the last slide? Steve, can you just talk very quickly whether the 5-year plan has a bigger impact on the state sector or the private sector?
Yes, May and Steve, is actually, I think now we also only have around 10 minutes left.
Okay.
And this is actually very good, like talking about the ESG and family planning, because it's about aging. Is about the pension. This is all very important. So we also have a lot of audience give us some question as well.
Okay.
So how about we're doing this way before we round it up, and then we answer at least 1 or 2 questions. That's very good feedback, because people think that's very comprehensive, very in-depth. They try to take some notes, but then they still have a lot of questions. So let me give you 1 question, but I just resonate what Steve and May, you just mentioned about that. The policy, there's major policies, the people like analysts, economists already have a lot of predictions or forecasts about this. So our current student also studying the first-hand informations from the Chinese information directly, like the formation and the policy, but also if with the help like we're in China for this kind of like independent and engaging content, speaking in the story to telling a student, that would be a very good help for a student to understand. And of course, at the same time, to learn the first-hand information in a platform here. So you mentioned about all this kind of information is what will we cover. Like May, you're going to talk about family planning, the aging population. And Steve, you mentioned about like these sustainable finance, ESG, technology, land reform, especially capital market reform. We need to talk about more of that later on. Yes, this is all the courses like ESG that we could cover. But before we move on, I have 1 question for you. It's from one of our audience here, Check Yu Xu. And the question is that, is there an evaluation mechanism to measure and assess the achievement and the shortfall of the previous 5-year plan?
Actually, when I said earlier that the last 5-year plan was begun in 2013, what that really is the start of the evaluation process, where they are actually figuring out what has been achieved and what hasn't been achieved, and what needs to be maybe beefed up or re-emphasized in the coming 5-year plan. So the evaluation process kind of happens with primarily the NDRC. But that evaluation process remains still, I think, pretty much under wraps. That is not made public, that the Chinese government and the NDRC feels they got high marks on this and low marks on that. So that is less transparent, but it certainly happens. And the leadership itself would have very clear ideas of where the 5-year plan has been, where the evaluation is positive and where it is not so positive.
Yes. And we also have another student is actually like a steering in charge of ESG and low carbon. Why is that also under, like Xi Jinping mentioned about the very important ESG? And May, you even introduced these sentences to one of her students. The sentences like 金山, remember the sentences that were introduced students? Yeah, 金山银山. So this part here is also very important as well. Yes. So now, because now we can see, and this, so you're talking about the mechanism and achievement. So back to the NDRC. So NDRC and also CDR and success is also very important for the state-owned enterprise. And then the relationship, how to deal with them, is also very important as well. Yes. So because we are really thank you for our audience showing interest. We have a lot of good topic for today. We can't deliver all, but definitely there were many opportunities that we can learn together and exchange insight, and to get more information to our corporations and to our connection and then to our students. So, and May and Steve, I would like you to give a summary for today's event, and then we round it up for today. May.
Actually, maybe instead of a summary, I want to focus on 2 things as like a takeaway. We'll say China's, again, during Deng Xiaoping time, the reform time, everything is about GDP. Remember the 小康社会, that goal was to make sure per capita GDP reach 800, for example, $800 by turning of the century. But today, we are not just talking about the per capita GDP. And that's why it comes up with the ESG and all the other concerns. Is we call it 全面小康. It means it goes beyond GDP. It also includes eradication of poverty. And I'm not sure if you know how much effort the government officials at all levels had put in this, because the deadline is just end of next month. And if you're in your area or your village, your county, there's still poverty, or then you will be held accountable. So now the government is basically distributing money to the really poor families to just in order to lift them above the poverty line. Because some of the family, for example, they are sick or they have mental health issues. It just doesn't matter what kind of opportunities you provide them, they just cannot pull themselves up. That's the way. And so now the government is just giving them the money to help them rise above poverty line. And a second one is this aging population issue. As we know, because Deng Xiaoping used per capita GDP as the measure or measurement for 建立小康社会. So when he put out that concept in 1980, the government really start to enforce the family planning policy. Prior to that, there was a policy, but that there was no enforcement. So the one child policy really got become draconian in the 1980s. But after 35 years of this policy, China has developed a new issue, which is aging population. For example, right now, the lifespan of Chinese people has risen from 44 years at the founding of the People's Republic to 77 years today, and is expected to go to 80 years by 2050. And right now, China's old people or old population, which means people older than 65 years old, account for 17%, but that number will go up to 36% by 2060. That's why the government realized there's no need to, or not no need, but it should definitely relax the family plan policy. And also because these days, as people get richer, people don't want to have many children, even if you're allowed to have 2 kids, but it seems the majority of people prefer to have one.
That's good.
So
That's a takeaway.
that's, yeah, the population, the family plan policy is a famous and infamous issue. A lot of Westerners actually don't understand or attack China, continue to attack China as a human rights violation. But it's very complex. We will need a whole nother session actually to do a deep dive on that.
Exactly. How about Steve, what will be the latest issue or the coming week in China this Friday? What will be the focus talking points?
This week, we're going to be focusing on the news that's been breaking of various bond market defaults, which is causing some concern, particularly given that some of these bond market defaults are linked to local governments from places like Henan. One of them is linked to a company that has a joint venture making cars with BMW. So you have them coming from different industry sectors. There's even a rumored default that's been going on with one of China's sort of, leading players and push to become a big player in semiconductors too. So we'll be looking in depth at where these particular defaults and what might actually come next, and whether or not it's a concern, particularly now that so many foreign investors buying large volumes of Chinese government bonds, Chinese bonds now, and becoming more important. They're becoming a more important player in the bond market. So the bond market in China is becoming very much a global issue as opposed to just a local issue.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. Thank you very much. I just make a small summaries. It's indeed very important to understand the 14th five-year plan, the China 14th five-year plan, because actually it touches mainly social policy and economic initiative, which will have an impact on our audience industry and the investment return, and in general the social life. You mentioned about the dual economic dual circulations economic model for promoting the GDP and the aging populations and fintech, ESG, or the 5G manufacturing 2025 and urbanizations, aging populations, etc. So this is all important, especially if you have an investment portfolio in China, or you want to understand much more for the risk management control and deep understand China's insight, so as to have your bigger share in the China market. So thank you very much for Steve and May today to give us such an insight and wisdom. If all our students would like to know more, follow with us for the next section. We're looking forward to seeing all of you soon. So if today you can't ask more questions, please send us a question in LinkedIn or in Facebook. We're happy to follow up for all the questions and with a private conversation with you. So thank you very much for the audience today, and thank you for your time. And this is a wonderful event, and thank you, May and Steve again. We're happy to work with Week in China. That both is like excellent, providing the excellent information and in-depth information about China. If you want to know more about China, come to Week in China and come to learn from Finance Mandarin. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.